Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Danny Phantom. Okay, so this episode, Masters of All Time, this episode essentially centers around Vlad. Specifically, it centers around the what-if idea of what if Vlad married Maddie instead of Jack? That is essentially what the premise is. And it opens up a lot of interesting character revelations and lore revelations for the series, and a couple other things that we're going to get into, but it's a fun story. But in case the episode opens up with, of course, with Sam, Danny, and Tucker all hanging out at the Nasty Burger, enjoying a meal. They're just kind of hanging out. When suddenly, Jazz proceeds to barge into the Nasty Burger and tells Danny to hide, which, of course, Danny is very visibly confused as to why he would hide, but then we find out exactly why Jazz told him to hide. As it turns out, we then proceed to see Danny's parents dressed up in their most 80s-tastic selves. They're just very decked out to the nines in 80s gear, and essentially they're just acting very 80s and essentially just making a public spectacle of themselves, because as we find out, they are there at the Nasty Burger for the Nasty Burger's 80s night. But what we find out is that the Nasty Burger has not actually set up the 80s night yet, and they're a little early. So of course they show up and are a little bit embarrassing to obviously Danny and Jazz, which Jazz tries to cover by claiming that she has disguised her. She wants to pretend she disguises herself as Sam's sister, telling her that they asked they're related. Which of course Sam points out that it'll cause a little bit of explanation to do, pointing out that she's obviously a lot more cheery than Sam is, which kind of works because her parents are a lot more cheery as well. But it makes sense. But of course, at this point where Maddie proceeds to publicly embarrass Danny by giving him his wallet, telling him that he forgot it at home, and pulling him into a big loving hug, which of course he's very visibly frustrated about, because especially since his parents are acting very 80s. But of course Sam points out that it'll probably be fine, pointing out that it's not like everything that's going. It's not like his parents are going it's going to be exposed to the entire school or anything. At which point Mikey then proceeds to film it for the entire school to go up on YouTube. So, of course, Danny, of course, gets frustrated and leaves, and then proceeds to storm off, wishing he had less embarrassing parents. But it's at this point where he comes outside and then proceed, and it's at this point where he's suddenly confronted by Vlad, who suddenly appears out of nowhere. And of course, Danny is very visibly confused as to why Vlad is there, but also proceeds to wonder if Vlad has any sort of quips about dating his mother and wanting to be with his mother, and how his dad is an idiot, and all the other things he usually spouts off about. But it's this point where Vlad reveals that he actually does not have any sort of real witty banter, pointing out that he doesn't have enough time for that. Which explains why. So I should explain. Vlad is in his ghost form during this entire conversation, and he at this point jumps down into the Nasty Burger parking lot. At which point he reveals that he proceeds to change back to his human form, and reveals that he actually has ecto-acne again, and he doesn't know where it came from. So he explains to explain, and of course at this point where Sam and Tucker proceed to join him outside and wonder what exactly is going on. But of course at this point where Vlad proceeds to explain that Danny has to help him find a cure before it's too late. But of course Danny has no interest in helping his mortal enemy find a cure for something that'll probably kill him, and asks him why he should. At which point Vlad points out that that's an interesting question, and then proceeds to pull out a gas canister and throws it at Sam and Tucker's feet, which Danny is unable to do anything against, but he quickly discovers that Sam and Tucker now have ecto-acne as well. At which point, Vlad then proceeds to tell him that Danny has an ultimatum he needs to complete. That's either Danny gets him the cure for ecto-acne, or he and his friends are going to die. And with that, Vlad proceeds to pass out. And so this point where of course Danny tries to shake Vlad awake, demanding to find that Vlad tell him the cure right now and how to cure his ecto-acne. pointing out that it's out that this isn't funny. But it's at this point where his parents proceed to barge out, and Danny and of course demand that Danny get away from their college friend, which of course Danny has no real option to oblige. Well, it's at this point where Jazz proceeds to walk out and starts looking for Danny, but then also realizes her parents are outside as well. So she plays it off about the fact that she can't find Danny, so she immediately goes back inside. Which Danny of course takes the opportunity to get out of sight of his parents by just going back inside, changing into his human form, and walking back out with his sister to wonder what's going on. And of course, we find out is that Jack and Maddie immediately are able to identify what's happening to Sam Tucker and Vlad as ecto-acne, and realizing that they have an outbreak, they need to take them somewhere where they can be quarantined and for study. And of course, Danny is frustrated because what we find out is that means putting them in the basement and running tests on them to figure out where the ecto-acne came from. And of course, Jack will not leave Vlad's side, insistent that he'll pull through. With Jack just being Vlad just being very visibly annoyed that Jack is waiting on him hand and foot. Which, considering Vlad has a very one-sided relationship with him, and it's ironic, and it's just continuing that thread. But meanwhile, we find out that Maddie is currently studying Sam and Tucker to try and figure out what's going on with their ecto-acne, and we quickly find out is that she can't find out what she's finding out several ecto-impurities that are preventing her from curing it. She doesn't fully understand why it's being so stubborn to cure. So, and of course, Danny is visibly frustrated as well, pointing out that he really wishes his friends will be okay, and does wind up threatening Vlad as well, pointing out that this is entirely Vlad's fault. But Vlad proceeds to kind of gloat about how the fact that Danny can't do anything to him because he's a guest, and obviously beating him up isn't going to do anything. And Danny of course realizes that he's just visibly frustrated about the fact that his friends are probably going to die. But then he quickly remembers what could potentially save Sam and Tucker's life, as he realizes Vlad gave them ecto-acne because he's the villain, and realizes that if he goes back, and that the best way to solve the problem is to make sure Vlad Plasmius never existed. So he proceeds to go to the one ghost he knows who can help him with that exact problem, Clockwork. And Clockwork adamantly refuses. Clockwork admits that it's not his fault to let Danny go back in time and meddle with the fabric of time, pointing out that it could have very disastrous consequences. But Danny is insistent, pointing out that the entire reason his friends are sick is because of Vlad, and because Vlad is Vlad Plasmius, and points out if he can stop Vlad Plasmius from being created, that could potentially save his friends. And of course, once again, Clockwork is still adamantly refusing, but admits that since Danny seems that he's willing to learn his lesson the hard way, he ultimately relents and lets Danny go back in time. At which point, Danny is transported back in time to his parents' college days, back when they were still in college and working on the proto portal that they created, which would later become a much bigger version of the Fenton Ghost portal. And of course, Danny starts looking around, realizing that he must be in the 80s. And quickly realizes that he needs to figure out what's going on, and hopes nobody sees him. But quickly discovers that he actually blends, because one of the kids remarks that he has a cool outfit and that's stylish, which of course Danny just realizes means that he doesn't have to worry about people discovering he's a ghost. But it's at this point where he sees a flyer for Vlad and what is it? He sees a flyer for Vlad's, Maddie, and Jack's experiment with the proto portal, and realizes that that's most likely where he needs to go at the University of Wisconsin. At which means he proceeds to use his ghost powers to turn unchangeable and heads to the room where they're conducting their experiment. And of course, once again, we see the experiment that caused Vlad to become a half ghost, but we see it in more detail. Obviously, Vlad is very adamant about the fact that it will not work, but Maddie insists that it'll be fine, and reminds Jack to pour Ecto Purifier into the little generator that they created to power the machine. And of course, Jack immediately reaches for a container, But what we find out is that the reason the experiment failed is because Jack, like an idiot, didn't realize that he accidentally picked up Diet Cola instead of Ecto-Purifier. So he wound up pulling an entire can of Diet Cola into the machine. And of course, it's this point where we see the events that ultimately led to Vlad's transformation. Obviously, Vlad remarking that it's not going to work, while Maddie remarks that the readings for the portal don't seem quite right, and Jack just plowing ahead anyway, despite not the problem that there being an obvious problem with how the Ecto-Purifier and actually getting the portal to work. And Danny, realizing that this is the exact moment where Vlad transforms, springs into action and pushes Vlad out of the way, causing the discharge from the proto portal to bounce all the way around the room and eventually hit something. We don't see what right away. We'll get to that, but of course, in the process, Maddie is almost hit as well, and Vlad immediately pushes her out of the way, with them forming the relationship that Vlad claims they were supposed to have. Now that Vlad has saved Maddie's life, and Danny, satisfied about the fact that he's prevented Vlad Plasmius from existing, then has Clockwork send him back, and Clockwork does it. At which point Danny proceeds to appear back in his old neighborhood, pointing out that he's happy because there doesn't seem to be any sort of quarantine tent over his house, and remarks that everything seems to be normal. But then discovers something else is wrong with his house. It's just a regular apartment building with no ops center on top, no Fencer Works sign out the front, nothing that actually distinguishes it as Danny's home. At which point he goes inside and starts looking. He transforms back into his human form and starts looking around, trying to figure out what's going on. And what he discovers is that the house is a mess, and Danny doesn't fully understand why. He doesn't understand who's done this. He doesn't understand why the house is a mess. But then he quickly discovers. But then it's at this point where Jack immediately barges in, and what we find out is that Jack. What actually happened? Jack got hit with the blast from the proto portal, which caused him to develop the Ecto-acne instead. And in this regard, he then proceeds to demand to know what Danny is doing in his house, telling him that he's not supposed to come in. And of course, Danny tries to explain to him that he's actually his son, but also notices the Ecto-acne. And of course, not only does Jack remark that Danny shouldn't know about the Ecto-acne, but then proceeds to reveal that he has no son and that he's been living a single life for over a decade, for 20 years. And of course, it's this point where he proceeds to reveal that he has since become a vengeful half-ghost. And his form is essentially just Vlad Plasmius, but chubbier, because it's Jack. So, he's saying, but of course, he proceeds to turn into Jack Plasmius. And Danny, of course, is once again insistent that obviously that he doesn't fully understand why his father is suddenly a half ghost, but he does realize that the only way is to kind of try to talk some sense into him. And realizing that he has an unfair advantage at the moment, remarks that while he doesn't want to, he then proceeds to transform into his ghost form as well, which causes Jack to just further fly off the handle, exclaiming that he hates ghosts, and exclaims that it's ultimately ghosts who were the ones who actually stole his life away from him, and also stole the love of his life away from him. As we find out, it's at this point where Jack proceeds to continue to blast with Danny, and proceeds to reveal what happened about how he got hit with the ghost portal and all the other things. But Danny proceeds to point out that he's a little confused because it's obviously his dad, but also not his dad. But does know that he fights like his dad. So realizing that he needs to figure out what happened, he immediately is knocked into the basement by Jack Plasmius, and he winds up transforming and winds up going into the basement where he discovers what exactly he did. Not only does he discover that the lab is just a regular basement, but he also discovers both the proto portal as well as a framed photo where it's revealed that Maddie and Vlad got married and are now living in Wisconsin as dairy people, which of course makes Danny realize that he didn't change the past. He messed with the present, and it's at this point where Jack proceeds to come down to the basement with his ghost form, and proceeds to tell Danny to get out of his house and now it's time to say goodbye. But Danny defensively holds up the newspaper article that Jack has clipped out, and Jack proceeds to remark that realizes that it seems that all he ever says is goodbye. At At which point Danny proceeds to ask him what exactly happened with him, and Jack proceeds to explain in more detail what happened. After the proto portal went off, it did bounce around the room, but it hit Jack. It didn't. It hit something. It hit Jack, but not Vlad, because Vlad at this point wasn't hit full blast in the face with it. Jack was, and this of course resulted in Vlad marrying the love of his life instead, when in the actual timeline it's the other way around. And he proceeds to go on to explain how he ultimately lost the love of his life. But then after about a decade of that, he eventually gained superpowers and tried to debut as a crime-fighting superhero, which did not work out because we find out as we kind of find out, Jack decided to debut on Halloween, where naturally a lot of the quote-unquote ghosts are people in costume. So Jack wound up screwing up and trying to hunt a child instead of an actual ghost. So he became the laughingstock. At which point he moved into the apartment. He moved to the building that would ultimately become his house in the main timeline, with the guy immediately putting it up for sale because Jack used his ghost powers to accidentally chase the guy off, and ultimately that's what happened. That's how Jack wound up becoming the bitter half ghost. Meanwhile, it's at this point where Danny proceeds to pull out his wallet, revealing a picture of him and his family, which of course Jack is very visibly confused as to what it's supposed to mean, but Danny proceeds to explain that it was his fault. He explains that to Jack that it was ultimately his fault for accidentally ruining his life, pointing out that he only meant to go back in time to stop Vlad from becoming the half ghost, and Jack of course became the half ghost instead. But Vlad, and this of course causes Jack to become angry again. But Danny exclaims that he can fix it, and also remarks that but Jack just responds that that's just more lies. At which point he proceeds to get into another confrontation with Danny, and Danny is of course forced to flee, eventually hiding behind a billboard to get away from Jack, who is now in the warpath for him, and uses his duplication powers to search for Danny a bit more effectively. At which point Danny realizes that he really needs to get back to Clockwork, and needs to figure out how to undo the entire mess that he's done. And realizing the only other person who might have a ghost portal so that he can get back to Clockwork is Vlad. And realizing that his mother is with Vlad, he immediately flies off to Wisconsin to go and find Vlad and figure out and see if he can meet with him. And of course he proceeds to immediately shift back into his human form, and knocks on the door. And when of course Vlad and Maddie open the door, he weakly lets out a mom, which of course causes Maddie to immediately become very, very confused as to what's going on. And this is at this point where they bring him inside and ask him what's going on. And he proceeds to explain how he's looking for his parents because there was a quote-unquote accident. And of course Vlad reassures Danny, pointing out that that's obviously that he's visibly concerned. While Maddie points out that Danny has a very lovely name. It is revealed in this episode that Maddie was likely the one to have picked Danny's name out, because when Danny meets with Jack immediately exclaims that Danny is a stupid name. He openly admits that, but it's also implied based on the fact that we find out Jack also has a cat who is named after Jasmine, which is implied. It's implied that he didn't pick Danny, but he picked Jazz's name, which is interesting. But in case Vlad proceeds to reveal, in case a little side tangent along the way, Vlad then proceeds to reveal what ultimately happened to him. And of course Danny proceeds to remark, does proceed to ask Vlad if he has a ghost portal. But Vlad and Maddie point out that they don't have one. As we find out, in this timeline, Vlad is actually the successor to the Dairy King. He obviously is a lot more painstakingly self-made because he didn't have his ghost powers, which means he had to earn his fortune the hard way, rather than the easy way that he does by exploiting his ghost powers to become one of the most richest men in the world. So, and of course, the way he did that was by becoming the successor to the Dairy King. Obviously still living in the same castle that the Dairy King used to live in, but now actually earning his status as the next Dairy King. He's obviously become a milkmaid. He runs cheese factories. He's a very painstakingly self-made man. which of course is interesting. But of course, at this point, where if Danny proceeds to spy a closet full of gadgets and wonders if Vlad is, Vlad is not supposed to be they're not supposed to be a technological thing, then obviously that means that obviously he's wondering where all the gadgets come from. But of course, Vlad immediately confronts Maddie about it, and Maddie claims that it's actually that the quote unquote Fenton foamer that Danny saw in the closet is supposedly a shampooer, which for carpets, claiming that she doesn't actually hunt ghosts in secret, which is a lie. We'll get to that in a minute. But of course, Vlad, satisfied, does point out that obviously Danny is going to have to spend the night because they realize he's not going to be able to find his parents, and obviously he's in the middle of Wisconsin, so obviously it's going to take him a while to find his parents if he's in Wisconsin. So they volunteer to let him spend the night, which Danny is thankful for. And in any case, that night, Danny proceeds to sneak out of his room and uses his ghost powers to go where he knows Vlad's secret lab is. He proceeds to fly down into the basement and is looking around in the secret lab in the middle of Vlad's manor, but quickly discovers that while yes, Vlad has a secret lab, he doesn't have a ghost portal or anything else, which of course confuses Danny, pointing out that this is the same old Vlad he should know. So naturally, Vlad should have a ghost portal or something in his secret lab lying around. So at which point, Danny proceeds to dig a little deeper inside the house, and eventually he does wind up finding the ghost portal and a secret lab, which of course Danny exclaims that he found it. At which point, Maddie proceeds to come downstairs in her signature jumpsuit and claims that yes, Danny absolutely found it, all right. At which point, she proceeds to suck him inside her, this universe's version of the Fenton Weasel. She calls it the Maddie Weasel because in this timeline she didn't marry Jack, so all the inventions are named after her instead. But and so of course Danny proceeds to try and explain in vain that she doesn't understand, but it winds up being sucked inside the quote unquote Fenton Weasel. At which point she proceeds to strap him to a chair and to a table, and he wakes up. And he's strapped to a dissection table, and she, of course, immediately demands to know who he is and what he's doing there, pointing out that she's more than happy to dissect him molecule by molecule to figure out what he's doing there. And of course, Danny, really having no more choice other than to be dissected, does tell Maddie that she is in fact her son, as well as Jack's, which of course she finds preposterous, pointing out that she hasn't seen Jack in years, and with Vlad telling her that Jack never wanted to see her again. But Danny proceeds to point out that is a lie, pointing out that he just visited with Jack, and Jack misses her terribly. And of course, this is at this point where Jack proceeds to appear in the lab as well, revealing that he uses ghost powers to tail Danny to Vlad's manor, and reveals that that's all true, and that he has been trying to see Maddie for the longest time, and reveals that he's still madly in love with her and wishes he could be with her. But Maddie, very happy to hear Jack say that, then proceeds to pull him into a fierce hug. At which point she undoes the restraints on her son. And then also reasons that if Danny is in fact her son, then he must be her son from an alternate timeline, and they pull him into a hug as well. At which point Danny points out that this is just the good thing about having genius parents, pointing out that he's from an alternate timeline where they had kids and no longer have kids, is a totally valid excuse for him to be a half ghost. But and of course at this point where Danny proceeds to remark that he needs to find a ghost named Clockwork to undo the entire mess, but Maddie is already 100% ahead of him. At which point she proceeds to open all her data files on all the ghosts she knows, and pulls up her data file on Clockwork, which Danny points out she is good. And it's at this point where he's excited to return back to his own timeline and undo things. But it's at this point where he's confronted by Vlad, who points out that maybe it's time to discuss what Danny's currently doing in their timeline. And of course, Vlad doesn't have any ghost powers. But what we find out is that he's very, very angry about the fact that Danny has undone all his hard work to keep Jack away from Maddie. He as he puts it, he likes it this way. He points out that he's both successful and happy. So, Vlad wins in this timeline. He's happy about the fact that he gets to both be married to the love of his life, and he admits that he's happy that he gets to be a successful businessman. So he gets to have his cake and eat it too. But of course, he then proceeds to briefly fight Danny, while Jack proceeds to turn into his ghost mode and proceeds to fight Vlad, telling him that they're not going to let him take their son. But And at which point they proceed to jump into defend their son, and of course Danny joins the fight as well. But Danny eventually gets knocked onto the table, and once again Vlad proceeds to try and dissect him again. But telling him that he understands that Danny poses a threat to his happy home life. So he remarks that the only way to deal with the situation is to hurt Danny slowly and painfully. At which point he proceeds to get ready to turn on the laser to dissect him, and it's at this point where Jack proceeds to knock him away and destroy and kind of blast the laser out of Vlad's hand, telling him to get away from his son. At which point Vlad seemingly wastes Jack with the laser. Obviously, Jack uses his ghost powers to try and defend himself best he can, even summoning a ghost shield, but ultimately winds up not working, and in the process, Vlad accidentally damages the ghost portal, as well as seemingly fatally injuring Jack. And Maddie, angry with him, proceeds to grab him into a headlock, and and lifts him up by his collar. But of course, Vlad points out that she can't hurt him, pointing out that they're technically still married. But it's this point where Maddie proceeds to throw him into the ghost portal, telling him to consider that an annulment. At which point, Vlad proceeds to float inside the ghost portal and is immediately surrounded by ghosts of all shapes and sizes. And while Vlad tries to make peace with him, claiming that he loves ghosts, he's ultimately unable to stop his fate, which is being torn limb from limb by ghosts in the ghost zone. And he's ultimately killed in this timeline. So, or at least that's the implication. We don't see what happens to him, but it's implied he dies. But in case, Maddie then proceeds to tell Danny to release Danny from the restraints, telling him that the portal is destabilizing and it won't stay open forever, and tells him to go. At which point he flies through the ghost portal, and she's just happy to have him as a son. At which point he proceeds to fly back to Clockwork's lair, which is obviously outside of the confines of space-time changes and all those other things. And of course, Danny once again comes to Clockwork, asking him to help fix the past. Which, of course, the Clockwork adamantly points out that it was Danny's own fault for screwing up the timeline, and pointing out that he obviously understands that Danny going into the timeline, changing the time stream, was ultimately the mistake. Pointing out that that Sam and Tucker's fates exist in the present, and not the past. And then proceeds to insist that he will only be resetting the timeline back to the before the moment that Danny interfered, but nothing else. Which of course Danny is sad to hear, but then discovers that he actually now knows the cure for curing the Ecto-acne, because the last thing that Clockwork shows him from the timeline change is the moment where Jack pours Diet Cola into the machine, which causes it to blow up in Vlad's face. And realizing that's it, he flies off, while Clockwork gives a knowing smirk, implying that he knew that this was what was going to happen all along, because of course he did. So he says this point where Danny flies home, he doesn't put on a quarantine suit right away, and it's at this point where Maddie immediately asks him what he's doing, pointing out that he needs to put on a quarantine suit. But it's at this point where Danny then proceeds to reveal that he's seemingly figured out that he believes he's figured out why Maddie is unable to identify the ecto impurities that are causing the ecto-acne. He then proceeds to ask her if the impurities are in fact consistent with some of the things you would see in, say, Diet Cola. And Maddie, of course, thinks that's preposterous at first, but then looks over her information again and discovers that yes, Danny is in fact correct. And of course asks Danny how he knew, but and Danny lies and tells her that being the son of two ghost hunters, he figured it out. He just applied his brain. But in case with that, they then proceed to mix Diet Cola into the ecto purifier that they were using to try and cure the ecto-acne, and it works. Everybody winds up being happy, except for Vlad, where Jack is just continuing to beat on his chest, trying to get him to live, while also trying to trying to share a cup of Diet Cola with him. And now satisfied that his friends are going to die, he pulls them into a hug, happy that they're going to be fine. Well, but at this point, he proceeds to go and confront Vlad, who is happy that Danny saved his life, but also admits that he's too weak from the ecto-acne to actually fight against Danny anymore, and asks them if they can be bygones. At which point, Danny responds to that by drop kicking Vlad all the way back to Wisconsin, responding bygones. And It's in the episode then proceeds to end with Danny proceeding to celebrate his time with his parents at the 80s night. Obviously Jazz is trying to hide her embarrassment, but it's of course at this point where Danny proceeds to reveal that he's not embarrassed anymore, pointing out that he's learned to accept his family's past and is very happy with things the way they are. Which of course obviously Jazz points out that she's not particularly happy about that, but does admit that Danny does at least seem happy. But yes, of course, at this point where we find out that in the end it's going to be on the entire internet now. So there's that. But in case this episode, again, as I said, has a lot of lore revelations and character revelations. Obviously, this episode reveals that we already discussed this, but this episode reveals that Jack wasn't the one to name Danny. He names Jazz. So and then of course Danny is of course revealed to actually have been Maddie's idea. Danny was Maddie's name that she picked out for him. Meanwhile, we also find out that Vlad apparently didn't need his ghost powers to become rich and successful. He could do that all on his own. We find out that Vlad was very. It would have taken a little bit longer, of course, but we find out that Vlad was very able to afford his wealth and be successful and happy by just being the new Dairy King. That is all he needed to do. He didn't need to use ghost powers to try and take over the world, become the most powerful half ghost in history. Didn't need to do any of that. He just needed to apply himself. But the fact of the matter is, his ghost powers kind of made him lazy. But also, this episode kind of looks a little bit more into ghosts and how they're created. Obviously, we know half ghosts specifically, but we know half ghosts. We know from interviews that not everybody can become a half ghost. Case in point, it's heavily implied that it's stated several times that Sam and Tucker would have died because of the ecto-acne, even though the ecto-acne in Vlad's case was what enabled him to turn into a half ghost, which is interesting. It implies that not everybody is able to become a half ghost, but also it seems that the ability to become a half ghost, whether or not they actually are, runs in the family. Because not only do we see, I wasn't going to talk about this, but Butch Hartman has created pictures for a 10 years later thing that have since been retconned by a new book that came out. But essentially in the 10 years later, we find out that Danny and Sam have kids, and obviously they're both half ghosts. They inherited their dad's powers, which is cool. But we also find out that it does run in the family in this episode, because according to the episode, Jack could become a half ghost if he were ever caught in some sort of accident that caused him to become one. Obviously, he's not in the main timeline, but he is in the alternate timeline, which I do find interesting. We do find out that he's capable of gaining ghost powers in that way. So, that's a bit of an interesting lore revelation. Jack can become a half ghost, and it seemingly runs in the family, at least on his side. We haven't seen Jazz develop any sort of ghost powers or anything like that, but it's implied that if Jazz, we did see once, but Nightmare Hospital was revealed to be a special case because it was implied that everybody with ghost powers would eventually burn out, but maybe Jazz wouldn't have, because she's blood related to Danny and Jack. Obviously, she would have likely have gotten that from Jack's side of the family, if that were in fact to happen. It seems the ability to become a half ghost is passed down through DNA, which makes sense given what we know from the intro. It's implied that Jack would have passed on his. If we're going by this lore revelation, by what happened in the episode, we know that if Jack had been caught, that Jack was not caught up in the accident, but he would have been fine. He would have developed ghost powers. And given that we now know that it works by blood and by DNA, it's possible that Jazz also has the ability to become a half ghost, and we've just never seen it. That could be interesting. That could be an interesting avenue to explore, because especially if they're continuing the series in graphic novel format, that's an interesting idea they could bring up. Jazz becoming a half ghost, possibly. I don't know if they're gonna do that, but that's an interesting story idea if they bring that up. I don't think I've ever thought about that. Jazz could become a half ghost. That could be fun. But of course, yeah, that's essentially what the premise is. It shows the alternate history where Jack becomes a half ghost, which brings up a lot of lore and character revelations. I like the episode. It's a fun episode. But in case, that's going to do it for my review of Danny Phantom. What did you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Discord if you want to help support me. Go check that out, especially since at the end of the week, we are going to be doing a horror movie watch along. So please go do that. Go check that out. I don't know what day yet. I have to message some people, but I hope you guys will go and hang out and go do that. I would appreciate that if you would. But go do that. And also be sure to go and check out my Twitch. I stream Saturdays and Sundays. We're streaming horror games the entire month, so please go check that out. And this is actually the last weekend, so I have to pick one last horror game to play, but we'll do that. But yeah, go check that out. And also be sure to go and check out my my Patreon if you want to support me. I would appreciate it if you did. Again, only a couple bucks a month. Please go check that out. And also be sure to go check out the playlist linked in the end screen if you want to support me even further. But the top video is the top playlist is the most recent playlist, which was Magus month. I did that for my birthday. Please go check that out. Whereas the bottom playlist is the playlist that I did for the last Halloween event that I did, which was Courage Month, where I reviewed Courage the Cowardly Dog for the entire month of October. I hope you guys will go check that one out as well. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!